Well, hello and welcome once again to the DCL podcast, where we're inviting you to sit back, relax, and we'll be on our way shortly. Well, welcome back to the DCL podcast, and we are coming back to you with another trip report. This one is one that I am really excited to do because I think this is a trip that has been on, or is on, pretty much everybody's bucket list. But kind of like the Panama Canal, it's tough to fit in. So today I want to introduce and welcome to the show Brett from Wisconsin. How are you doing today, Brett?
Great, Steve. How are you?
Not too bad. And I really want to thank you for coming on, taking time out of your day to share your trip report with our listeners. And I'm going to let you tell us which trip you went on.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about our cruise on the 13-night eastbound transatlantic from Miami, Florida to Barcelona, Spain this past May.
Yeah, and I think that is something that's a cruise that's like on everybody's bucket list. Pretty much everybody I've talked to is like, I would love to do that someday. And is this now, before we jump into it, how many cruises have you been on with Disney?
Sure. So prior to this voyage, we've been on 6 cruises with Disney Cruise Line.
Okay, and where were they, or where did you take them to?
So those were either Western Caribbean or Eastern Caribbean cruises. So prior, we had sailed on the Disney Magic, the Disney Wonder, and the Disney Fantasy.
Okay, and that's what I'm kind of getting at is you took we were talking beforehand, and you've taken 6 cruises. This is your 7th. Was this something that was kind of rolling around in your back of your mind as something that you guys wanted to do, or how did it come about?
Yeah, it's funny because so I went on these cruises with my parents, and we had talked about how we really enjoyed these Caribbean, generally 7-night long cruises, because it's a nice escape from reality and there's generally great entertainment. Everything that we know and love about Disney Cruise Line is very consistent. But what we found after a while is, and part of it was based on going on many of these cruises during relatively a short period of time, about 6 years, we felt like, you know what, it's great, but the experience is becoming very similar based on the destinations we're visiting. Wouldn't it be cool if we had an opportunity to go to a new place, but still with familiar elements? So the notion of a transatlantic cruise originally hadn't entered our mind, but we kind of saw some reports from previous individuals who have gone on these voyages and thought, wow, this looks incredible. All these days at sea, which we really love, perhaps even more so than the days ashore. And that encompasses a big part of the cruise, complemented by some really neat destinations. So the notion of going on a transatlantic entered our radar probably a while back, and then thankfully, we had the opportunity to book one of these cruises.
Yeah, I think that's kind of neat because there's so many, you kind of get in that, I don't want to say rut's not the right way, but you kind of have those ideas of this is what I want to do, and you do it over and over and over again, kind of like going to Disneyland or Disney World, and then all of a sudden something else opens up, whether it's if you're a parks goer and all of a sudden you realize, hey, there's this cruise line, and it just opens up a whole new world. And I kind of feel like that can happen with DCL in the sense of just the different destinations where, you start thinking wow, that would be kind of cool to do, spend more time at sea and whatnot. So I think that's kind of a neat thing. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely. There's always the desire for some novelty from your Disney experience. And you want the typical elements of the brand that are reliable and that bring about joy, but you also want to feel like you're getting something special out of it, right? So that every cruise has its unique elements.
Exactly. Okay, so let's go into it. So you traveled with your parents on this cruise. So it was 3 people that went?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. And what was your Disney experience beforehand? Did you guys like to go to the parks? Did you guys jump right into Disney Cruise Line, or how did you find Disney Cruise Line?
Yeah, it was something that had entered our radar many years ago. So growing up, I lived in Arizona, so trips to Disneyland were pretty accessible in terms of just a 6-hour drive away. So we went to Disneyland, well more than a dozen times during my childhood. Went to Disney World a number of times as well. But as I was entering undergrad, we were saying, we love going to the parks, and we had been to a couple of the D23 expos as well. We're really appreciating these different types of Disney experiences. And we had known about Disney Cruise Line. We had talked about it at different points. For one reason or another, we didn't go in that direction at the time. And we thought, you know what, I'm getting older, and might as well just do like one nice final family trip and go on a Disney cruise. And then 7 years later, we've gone on 6 more cruises. But essentially, we were hooked from the moment we stepped aboard the Disney Magic. Yeah, we love the just general ambiance of being in a Disney environment, with it being very genial. The quality of the service is always extremely high. Entertainment, fun offerings, and just good people. So Disney Cruise Line is all that and more. As you know, and as many of the listeners know, Disney Cruise Line is really the parks, but to a really a higher level in terms of immersion.
Definitely. Okay, well, let's talk about your cruise itself. Now, you guys have been on 7-day cruises, and all of a sudden you're going on a 13-night cruise. What kind of went through your mind as far as planning-wise? Did anything kind of change, or what kind of thoughts went through your head as far as planning for a little bit longer cruise and heading towards Europe?
Well, and I think this is something that everybody really needs to be thinking about in terms of packing, and packing smartly, because there's only so much luggage that you can take. So like one thing we knew that we would be doing in the middle of the cruise, that we would be using the laundry on the ship, because it doesn't make sense to pack 13 shirts and 13 different outfits. So you want to definitely pack smarter, more thoughtfully. We also knew too that we were going to spend a couple of days afterward in Barcelona, where our cruise ended. So we wanted to make sure that we had all of our different tickets and any plans for dining and those things kind of figured out ahead of time. As many of you know, being out on the open sea, internet can be a little bit fickle, it can be slow, and it can be pretty expensive. So we wanted to make sure we had all of that taken care of well in advance. And same goes for the excursions, because sometimes those tickets are sold out pretty fast. So just kind of taking the same approach as one would with a typical Caribbean cruise, but thinking about the length, how much stuff you actually need versus want, because you have to bring all of that back to wherever your final destination may be. And yeah, there's only so much room in luggage for souvenirs and clothes and all of that stuff.
Definitely. I've been thinking about you see those pictures of people back in the 1920s going on their cruise to Europe with their big trunk, and it's not quite that way anymore, is it?
Not quite. No.
So did you overpack like all of us, or did you do it right?
I think we packed pretty right. We ended up having like an extra backpack that we stowed in our luggage to Florida that we ended up utilizing on our flight back from Barcelona. So that's another technique folks can use if you don't want to, initially use a piece of luggage, for instance, a backpack or a duffel bag or something like that. So that's a useful technique.
Perfect. Okay, well, let's talk about the cruise itself. So this one left out of Miami. Had you guys sailed out of Miami before, or were you mostly out of Port Canaveral?
We've been almost entirely out of Port Canaveral. We've had one out of Galveston, and I think we sailed on the Disney Wonder on one occasion out of Miami.
Okay, and how was that experience getting down to Miami, staying there, and then getting on the ship? Did you go through Disney to set up that stuff ahead of time, or did you guys just do it yourself?
Yeah, we just handled it ourselves, if I remember correctly. It was pretty smooth. Boarding was maybe a little bit later than usual. I know they weren't letting people on board until after 11:30 or so, maybe a bit later. But Disney runs a pretty smooth operation, even if it's not out of the Port Canaveral port. So yeah, it was a pretty seamless process to get on board.
Yeah, and I think Miami, we've done one sailing out of Miami, and I thought it was pretty easy to get. I mean, there's tons of taxis to go back and forth between the airport if you're flying in, or even staying at a hotel. So I think as far as a port, it's because there's so many cruise ships that leave out of it. There's a lot of different ways to get there that are pretty easy. So what kind of cabs? So there's 3 of you. What type of cabin? Did you book 2 cabins, or you guys just book one, or what did you guys do for that?
Yeah. We've only gone like one stateroom, and it works out just fine. We've gone with this past time it was an ocean view, but we had a veranda as well with, I think it was an obstructed view, so we got, I guess, a little bit of a better deal on it, but it worked out wonderfully. And I'm of the belief that unless it's a voyage like maybe an Alaskan cruise or perhaps the Mediterranean, where it's maybe absolutely essential to have an ocean view or a veranda, I think really what it comes down to is doing what's best for you and your family and space-wise too. So it worked out really wonderfully for us.
Do you think, like, I'm just thinking about that, with so many days at sea, do you think having a veranda, I hate to say, is it worth it? But
yeah.
Do you think, what are your thoughts on having a veranda on a transatlantic voyage?
I'm not sure if it makes a huge difference, because if you look at it this way, half the voyage is on the open water, so there's not a heck of a lot to look at.
Uh-huh.
But certainly the days in which you're at port, it's nice, and it perhaps adds an extra element of feeling immersed. But by the same token, I've always been under the belief that if you're spending time on the deck or in other parts of the ship, you're still getting that same experience. It's only if you're intentionally reading or sitting out, enjoying something to eat right on your veranda. So I think it really just came down to the price-wise. It wasn't a huge difference, so it was like, might as well. So
right. Do you guys tend to spend a lot of time in the room, or do you tend to be out and about doing things?
Oh, we're out and about pretty much the entire day. So yeah, we just use the stateroom as a time to sleep, get changed, and that's basically about it.
Yeah, that's kind of our family too. And the one thing I do appreciate, though, after we've had two inside, having at least an ocean view, is we like having the light in the morning to kind of, and that may sound kind of crazy, but just to kind of know where you are a little bit. But
I hear you.
Yeah. Okay, so you guys get on board. It's a 13-night cruise. You guys are leaving out of Miami. I guess let's talk about the food a little bit.
Sure.
You're going to be with your servers for a long time. I'm trying to figure out the best way to ask this, I guess, is how did you guys kind of attack your meals? Did you go to the main dining rooms every night? Did you get a couple nights at Palo? Did you kind of mix it up? Or what were your thoughts going in, and then how did it kind of work?
Yeah. So typically we've always dined in the main dining room at dinner. There was one night where we actually went up to Cabanas for a change, just to kind of mix it up. We went to Palo brunch on one of the sea days, of course, and that's a fantastic experience. This was only our second time at Palo, and we feel it's totally worth the experience and the cost. But for dinner, we appreciate the experience. My mom and I are actually vegetarian, so it's always a bit of a concern for us. Are we going to be able to get stuff that meets our dietary needs? And Disney is consistently very good in that regard. There are always options, maybe a little bit repetitive. And I know even folks who aren't vegetarian, they might say, it feels like after a while, there's just not as much variety in terms of food or preparation, but the quality is generally very strong. As you might imagine, being on a 13-night cruise, you get very used to the similar types of offerings, but I'm generally always very pleased with the food quality of Disney, and really for vegetarians, I think they make things pretty good. So.
Yeah, so I know with people with food allergies, they can let Disney know ahead of time. And with being a vegetarian, on each one of the menus, they always offer the vegetarian options. Is that something that you let them know ahead of time, or do you just kind of take what they have once you get on board? Yeah,
so what we've done is we usually just tell them the first night, and they're very accommodating. There were even a few instances where I think there may have even only been two options, and they either were things we had before in one way or another, or they just weren't terribly appealing, and we were even able just to make a special request. And I think at times we got like pasta and vegetables, or several of the like salads or soup or side options. So it worked out really very seamlessly.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You can always ask them for other things that may not be on the menu. Like I know my youngest, he's a big fan of broccoli, which may surprise people, but
That's wonderful.
I know he's a huge broccoli fan. And so like every night he'd always ask for, can I have a side of broccoli? And they'd bring him a big side of broccoli every night. And so don't be afraid to ask, I guess, and I'm not telling this to you, I'm just throwing that out to our listeners, don't be afraid to ask for something, because if they can do it, they'll try and make it happen, it seems like.
Oh, and that definitely applies for desserts, because after night 4, there were many of us who were ordering 2 desserts. Or even better than that, Steve, we were actually making requests for the night after that in terms of what we wanted for dessert then too. So we were known as the table with all the sundaes.
Oh man, that's my table to be at. So, well, speaking of tables, so there's 3 of you. Did you guys have a table by yourself, or did they sit you with somebody else, or how did that work?
Yeah, we were actually seated with another family of 3 parents and a son who was a little bit younger than me. So we always appreciate the opportunity to get to know and talk with other Voyagers, particularly because a lot of the day, we either spend apart or we're partaking in some activities together. So it's always good to meet new people.
Definitely. What I noticed on the last cruise that we just went on, and they sat us next to a family of 4 as well, with kids roughly the same age. And it turns out we're from Oregon, and they actually happen to be from Oregon too. So they do a good job of, I know they do it consciously, trying to put similarities with people together. But at this time, they didn't put the tables together. They put it with just a little bit of a space. So it was kind of like, it was close enough that you could initiate and talk, but you didn't feel like you had to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I kind of appreciated that, only in the sense that, like, if it doesn't work out, and I've heard and usually it's always worked out for us to really have a good time with the people we sit next to, but I have heard instances where people either don't feel comfortable that way or whatever else. But I thought that was kind of a cool idea, where they kind of gave people a little bit of space to, if they wanted to talk, they could, but if not, they didn't feel like they had to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's kind of an interesting element to all of this is thinking about the venue you're in, because more recently on the Disney Magic, they now have the Rapunzel's Royal Table restaurant. And I think you had said you were recently on a Mediterranean cruise, so I'm not sure what your thoughts were of that restaurant, but boy, was that wonderfully themed.
Yeah, let's talk about it. I'm going to save some of my thoughts for when I do kind of our recap. But
Sure.
Yeah, what did you think of Rapunzel's Royal Table? So let's go back. The Disney Magic, for those of you who have not been on, they have Lumiere's, which is the French restaurant, the main French restaurant that's out of the main lobby. Then they also have Animator's Palette, and then they have the new restaurant, which is Rapunzel's Royal Table, excuse me. So what did you think of it?
I was really excited about this. I love Tangled. I'm glad that it's getting its due in terms of both the production on the ship and now this restaurant. And it feels like a Tangled day at sea of sorts, depending on how you frame your experiences. The restaurant is extremely well themed. It definitely evokes that sense of being in the Snuggly Duckling, although actually the bar on the ship, O'Gill's, they turn into the Snuggly Duckling, but this had kind of the same ambiance and vibe. On 2 nights, they have a bit of a production where they have some of the thugs walking around the ship, restaurant, I should say, as well as Rapunzel and even Flynn. And that just adds such a nice ambiance and almost like a dinner show element. What I will say, though, is that it can make it very hard to have conversations with others because it is so loud in the restaurant. So it just depends on how you want to frame your experience for those particular nights, because I know it was very hard to have conversations with one another, but we really appreciated the fact that each of the characters came to the table, and many of us got quick pictures. They had like a kingdom celebration where different people stood up and kind of danced around in a circle. It was really quaint, and it has that nice Disney touch to it, which you would expect to be in full force on DCL.
Yeah, I really, so we were just lucky enough to be on the Wonder, so we went to Tiana's place just recently, and then also to Rapunzel's, and I really like this new kind of themed entertainment while you're while you're eating. And you're exactly right. The 2 nights where they do the show, it's a little bit tough to talk because there's so much stuff going on. But I really enjoyed the show itself, and I thought the food was really good at Rapunzel's. Matter of fact, I think we had some of our best meals, our favorite meals there this time.
And we had our best desserts there by far. I'm not sure if you had the fry pan sweetbread in the the Flynn's the spatula, but that was, or frying pan, I should say. That was pretty awesome.
Yeah, that, and I think my son liked it. It was a birthday cake celebration thing. I can't remember what it was called, but that was really good too. Well, so one last thing, we're kind of killing it here on food. One last thing on food, since you've got 13 nights. What do they do? So they've got 2 nights where they do a show. Did they change the menu around very much at the different places, or was it kind of the same thing and just kind of going there to have dinner and kind of enjoy your time with your server and the people around you?
Yeah, both. They had 3 different rounds of the standard rotational menu. So again, you have that experience at each of the restaurants. On other nights, they had, again, some of the standard ones that you might find on the Caribbean voyages. They have, I think it's called the Captain's Gala menu. There was the first night menu, but they had some different ones. They had a transatlantic menu, World of Flavor, which had some more regional specialties. I think there was one called Land and Sea. So they certainly mix it up in terms of the theme of the menu, and there, like I said, there were some different offerings, so that certainly made it nice for just the notion of being on such a long voyage. However, I will say that at the buffet in Cabanas, particularly for lunch, they usually had a station where they changed the theme of the station every day. So one day was, I think, build your own crepe. Another day it was build your own sandwich. So it was nice that they also demonstrated that variety on up there too. I'm not sure if that's across the fleet or on all voyages, but that's something we noticed on this longer voyage.
Yeah, I think they do that to an extent, but I'm sure you probably noticed things that they don't normally do on the shorter sailings is my guess. So having to make your own crepe. I haven't seen that yet, but that would be kind of neat too.
Yeah, it was.
Well, cool. I think we. Anything else you want to talk about as far as food goes, or?
I think that pretty much covers the food front. There was so much on the entertainment front that I don't know where to get started with that.
Well, let's just jump into that because that's where I was going to go next. Okay, so now you start off and you have 6 days at sea, really 7 starting off with that first night, and it looks like they had a different show every night. But before we go into the shows, what are some of the things that you guys like to do, during the day or in the evenings? What were some of the things you were looking forward to doing?
Yeah, well, we consistently love the trivia games, generally, whether it be the Disney-themed ones that are more geared for the adults, but also the music trivias. We're usually in O'Gill's quite a bit, mm-hmm. and we typically saw a lot of the same people there too, and that was a fun environment. But what we really most enjoy about DCL, Steve, is the quality of the musical and theatrical entertainment. And Disney delivered so well on this voyage. I think the highlights for us were Cara Lindsay and Kevin Massey, who are Disney on Broadway stars. She was in Newsies and he was in Tarzan. And they're a married couple and they perform together, and they were fantastic. They had a performance early on in the voyage in the Walt Disney Theater that was actually framed. Not only were they incorporating some of their Disney songs and just regular Disney Broadway songs, but also it was kind of framed in a narrative that told their life story together. So there were pictures on the screens that were showing how they met and how they fell in love and kind of their career together. So that was pretty spectacular.
Yeah, I was just looking at so it looks like they offered some of the usual stuff that the Magic offers, like Twice Charmed. They have Tangled one night. Yeah. But, having this longer sailing and having, some of those, you and I were talking ahead of time, like we had Jeff Curdy on, an author, several shows ago, and having that opportunity to have people like that on board to give you those special sort of acts or opportunities to learn or see about the Disney company or Broadway in that sense is kind of a neat option on these type of longer sailings. Did they do a show maybe like down at Fathoms that you guys could go and actually ask them questions and stuff like that later in the trip as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And that provided a more intimate experience as well. So Kara and Kevin there was a Q&A featuring them and our club host. And it was kind of a brief, I think it was maybe 30, 45 minutes. It was pretty short. But then afterward, they went up to the Preludes area and signed pictures and had photos taken, or had, the guests could take pictures with them. And we participated in that and really had a nice few-minute conversation with them. We saw them around the ship throughout the next week or so. So it was very, very nice. I really liked them. And that's what's really nice about the transatlantic voyage. You are on, one of the classic ships, so it's a little bit smaller and more intimate, but complemented by the fact that there were only around 2,100 other guests on board. You were seeing the same people, and it felt like a community. And certainly the performers and these guest entertainers were on vacation too. So that made it really fun. I know that's kind of typical, but the fact that you are on such a long voyage affords the opportunity to have those conversations fairly frequently.
That's kind of a neat thing. And I've seen that they seem to be fairly approachable too. They had, and I'm totally drawing a blank, but they had a gal. She was the understudy for Mary Poppins on our just recent voyage, and I went down to Mara. Oh, geez, I can't believe I'm forgetting her name. But she had kind of one of those question and answers, and it was really kind of cool. It was the kind of the same thing where she shared her story, how she got to where she got, and she was very humble, very very funny, and it was fun to see that interaction of people being able to ask her questions and go up and talk to her afterwards. And I think that's the kind of thing that, like you're talking about, that you get on DCL, but especially on a longer voyage like this, that really makes it special.
Right. And you had also mentioned the notion of, lectures and other offerings to really appeal to the more adult crowd, to the Disney connoisseurs. We have Ridley Pearson, the author of the Kingdom Keepers series.
Oh yeah.
We know that he sailed on, I think, maybe the Panama Canal in the past, and some other longer voyages. And he had, maybe six different presentations plus 2 writers' workshops. Have you seen him before?
I've not in person, but my kids have read the books, and I know who he is. So yeah, that would be incredible to be able to talk to him and see some stuff from him.
And it was pretty funny because, mind you, most of the lectures were in the Buena Vista Theater. It was almost entirely adults. There were some children, and 1 or 2 asked some questions, but like Ridley was talking about the history of each of the theme parks in Walt Disney World, the history of Disneyland, and he updated it, I think, from previous voyages from what he indicated, and he showed these really rare photographs of early construction of Magic Kingdom and Disneyland, and it was fascinating. The first presentation talked about his childhood and his career, so we really got a sense of all different sectors of his life. There was a Q&A opportunity too. I actually talked with him on several occasions. He was so approachable and warm, and he just really valued, people who were consistently going and participating, because I think it's very fulfilling for them to have that type of engagement with the audience.
Oh, definitely. Was there anything else that you guys got to experience entertainment-wise that you hadn't seen maybe on the other ships, having, 7 days at sea for them to kind of fill your guys' time and people's time on board? Was there anything else that you can remember that you guys got to do that might have been a little bit different?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll list a bunch of these things out because I could talk about them for a long time. But some of the highlights, galley tour behind the scenes of Lumiere's and Animator's palette. Brief, but it was kind of cool to see all the dishes being prepared that you have to sign up for, I believe, at the guest services. So you have to inquire about that early on. That's something we had heard about from other cruisers, so that's worthwhile.
Good tip there.
Yeah, so make sure some of these specialty things, inquire the very first day, and if the folks at guest services aren't familiar, try to see if you can speak with someone as part of the cruise staff or the folks who work directly with like the club hosts and those folks, because they're generally very well informed as well. sometimes it requires a little digging to get those details, but it's worth it. Also, they showed classic Disney films in the Buena Vista Theater. So in addition to the typical recent theatrical releases, they had Into the Woods, Saving Mr. Banks, and The Rocketeer. So a bit of that more classic Disney. There was a really cool activity called Officer Hide and Seek. So about maybe 8 of the officers on board who, you would see walking around with their very regal white outfits, actually dressed up as different crew members. So you would all meet in the D Lounge. They would, you would see them. You could, take a minute to kind of look at what they look like, and then you give them a few minutes to get changed and hide. And you basically have 15, 30 minutes to run around the ship trying to find them, collect cards, and see who wins. Needless to say, we were not too lucky in that department. We could only find 2 of them, but that was really fun for the adults too. It wasn't just for the children. Also, a unique thing on some of these longer voyages and the European voyages is Freezing the Night Away, the Frozen Party. That also seemed to coincide with the most magnificent sunset I have ever seen in my life. You could see the sun just set beyond the horizon. So that's that's just a random thing, but nonetheless very cool. Also, adults who are wanting to spend time in the kids club beyond the typical open house sessions, they have adult exclusive open houses at night or at times in the mid-afternoon. So for instance, I think we were up in Vibe and they had improvisational comedy just for the 18 plus crew. Mm-hmm. So that was nice. Gosh, Steve, I could go on and on. I just want to mention a couple of other things. This was particularly unique. They had a cabaret act with the cast of the Disney Magic, and I think all of them or many of them were ending their contract on that particular voyage. So as a result, it was like a final show for them of sorts. So we were all in Fathoms, and they had a nearly 1 hour performance of just different Disney and Broadway tunes. And it was incredible. These folks had fantastic voices that really came to surface in this more smaller setting. So, and then there were some other really unique things too. Captain Fabian had a lecture on how cruise ships are built. So maybe the younger ones wouldn't be the most interested in that unless they have a desire to go into shipbuilding, but that was pretty sweet. We also had on one of the nights later on the cruise, they actually showed in the Buena Vista Theater a 10-minute sneak peek of Incredibles 2, which hadn't come out at that point. So we saw the opening scene of that film. And then the last thing I want to mention that was really cool was that Jeffrey Epstein, who's the director of corporate communications for the Walt Disney Company, he was actually going on the cruise for vacation, but I guess he and DCL talked and they created 3 different Ultimate Disney trivia games with him as the host. He's one of the main spokespeople and forces behind D23, and he had different offerings for people to partake in this Ultimate Disney trivia of sorts, and that was an absolute blast.
Wow, amazing. So many cool different opportunities. I would totally geek out about the shipbuilding. That's something I've wanted to hear and see them do, and now I guess I'm going to have to get on a transatlantic voyage with all these different offerings. But how did you guys do with the trivia? I bet you had some pretty obscure stuff on that one.
Let me tell you, there were some really, really good Disney experts in the room.
Yeah.
I played all the trivia games with my mom and then 2 other passengers, and we won one of the Ultimate Disney Trivias, which was awesome, and another one I think we placed second, and another one we were in the top 5. But like I'm Disney through and through, and some of these things were so obscure, and I'm like, there were some people who knew these extremely odd things, but it was a blast. Like they even had one that was themed around obscure Disney music.
Wow.
Where they play, kind of like what you see on some of those trivia shows. You hear like a few seconds of something and you have to identify it. You got to identify the film, the song title, and the singer or group. And it was things from like Touchstone films. That's how random it was. So yeah.
Wow. I mean, I'd struggle probably to get one, much less all three, including the group and some of those songs, I bet.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a blast.
Well, cool. So here's a question for you. So you're there for 7 days before you guys hit your first port.
Yeah.
Did you feel relaxed? Did you feel like you're super busy all the time? I'm just kind of wondering because like here you get 7 days and all of a sudden it's like boom, boom, boom. You guys hit 3 ports and you're there pretty much.
Right.
What was that kind of feeling like? Having all those days at sea and then all of a sudden getting prepared for your first port day.
Yeah. So we're the types of cruisers where we like participating in as much of the entertainment and games and activities as possible. So everything that I just mentioned, we participated in, and I love that. And, there were times where we just kind of relaxed and, hung out around Cove Cafe or the adult area. And that was nice, just kind of walking around the ship or using the gym. But we kept it pretty active. So we were kind of exhausted even at by the time we hit the Azores in Portugal. Yeah. So we were ready to be on land, but by the same token, we were sad after the sixth sea day and knowing that we only had one more sea day a couple days from that point, because we were having like the time of our lives. This was awesome. So, mind you, we wanted to experience Europe, but we were like, this is DCL at its best.
I think we all know exactly what you're talking about. Well, cool. Let's jump into the ports.
Sure,
you get to go to some pretty interesting places. The first one, the Azores, Ponta Delgada. Is that how I say it right?
Yeah.
I've been lucky enough to go there a couple times, not to Ponta Delgada, but a different island when I was in the Air Force. And I think the Azores are some of the most beautiful islands in the world. What did you guys have planned, and what did you guys do there, and what were your thoughts?
Yeah, so on previous Disney Cruise Line voyages, only occasionally would we participate in some of the excursions. We would either explore the port on our own or just, occasionally go on an excursion. This was the type of trip, however, we knew that we wanted the full experience. So we actually booked an excursion for each of the port days. And we were really glad that we did, because say for one that was a little bit more mediocre in Ibiza, Spain, we were very happy with all of our excursions. So Ponta Delgada, and I think we were on San Miguel Island in particular, we participated in the highlights of Riviera Grande tour. And it was a 4.5-hour tour where we took a bus and we saw this beautiful lake, and it's kind of a crater. So it was very beautiful. We walked around a bit of I think it was a national park or just a really beautiful area with lots of plants. And then there was this town, Riviera Grande, which had really just quaint architecture. And it concluded with going to a farm where we saw, I think it's pronounced the Lusitano horse. And they're these just beautiful, majestic horses. This family breeds them, and they're just very stunning. And we got to have a wine and cheese tasting in this beautiful countryside home. You could feel like you're in like all these really stunning places around the world. We kind of felt like we were in Italy, for instance, like the Italian countryside. Not that we've been there, but it almost evoked that feel, even though we were on the middle of an island in the Azores. So we really liked Ponta Delgada.
And then once the tour ended, did the ship park kind of downtown in the port? Could you explore the town as well, or did you kind of come back and get on the ship?
We went right back to the ship. So it was docked at the port, and there were some like little shops and restaurants right there, but it actually required a bit more of a walk to get right into town. So based on when it was in the day, and we were pretty tired, so we just went back to the ship.
Okay, so but people that may be going on this in the future, it's something that they could just get off in this port at least and walk into town if they wanted to, or maybe they had some buses that would take you the short distance. Yeah,
absolutely. That's definitely a worthwhile option.
Okay. Well, awesome. So you guys experienced the Azores, and you're back at sea for your one last time. Did you have anything special planned for that last day before you kind of finish out with the last couple ports?
I think it was more or less some of the same entertainment that I was describing earlier. So I think one of the last lectures or presentations by Ridley was on that day, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it was just trying to kind of pack our day as much as possible with that world-class entertainment.
Right.
So,
okay, from there you guys go on to Lisbon, Portugal, and what did you guys have planned there?
Yeah, so we're super excited about Lisbon. This was probably the second most excited place I was anticipating. Sadly, as many of you all know, with being on DCL or any cruise line for that matter, you have very limited time at shore for some of these places. So I think we only had about 7 hours at port, and we were booked for a 4-hour tour, which was a highlights that was both a walking and bus tour, where we saw part of, I think it's pronounced Alfalma, which is in kind of an older quarter of the city that was really cool. It had the cobblestone streets and it had that real authentic Lisbon feel. We also walked around the Maritime Museum, one of the monasteries, and we saw some of the popular tourist sites like I think it's the Tower of Lisbon, if I'm getting that correct. Mind you, some of those photo stops at the end were very brief. Like you basically had 5 minutes to get your picture and get back on. But the walking portion of the excursion, whereas a walking tour, was quite welcomed. We really got a feel of the city through walking around different quarters and regions.
So this is your first time in heading to Europe, Brett. What was your kind of take, being able to be in the old world sort of for that first time and taking things in? What were some of kind of your emotions, I guess, or thoughts as you're seeing all this stuff?
I was just enthralled. I was so excited about having this opportunity because I've been longing to go to Europe for a long time, and I'm very thankful that this opportunity to go on the cruise with my parents presented itself, because it really afforded us the chance to get a taste of Europe. I describe it a transatlantic cruise or some of these other voyages, depending on how you frame it. It's almost like having appetizers. You get a little taste of each of the places, and it whets your appetite for if you want to perhaps return there. So this was the perfect way of seeing parts of Europe that I don't think had even really entered our radar, going to Portugal and Spain. So I was just marveling like all the architecture and the artwork, and trying to pick up or at least understand, hearing Portuguese or Spanish or Catalan when we were in Barcelona. So it was perhaps not as immersive as if we were taking a purely land trip where we were just in the cities the whole time. But this was a nice early exposure where we got kind of the best of both worlds in that sense. So I just was constantly in awe of everything and how just beautiful everything was. I can't put it more articulately than that. Everything felt like it was special, and just looking at the construction of some of these buildings and knowing how much labor was put into them to essentially let them be these marvelous structures that we look back at centuries later. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think kind of to frame what you're saying, and I totally feel exactly what you're saying as far as DCL, but I think I want to go back to what Jeff Curdy said. He said something that's kind of struck my mind with Disney, and they do it in so many different ways, and not just Disney, but Disney definitely does it good. They do a great job of opening doors for people to see something or experience something that they've never done before. And once you walk through that door, maybe next time, you'll book that trip and just spend 2 weeks exploring Spain and Portugal on your own, and where you can immerse yourself a little bit more. But boy, I think the cruise line does such a good job of opening those doors for everybody to experience new experiences like this.
Yeah, I love the notion of that. That's a really good way of putting it. So yeah, kudos to Jeff in framing it that way.
Yeah, I don't know. That's I remember him saying that. It's just kind of stuck in my mind. So, well, awesome. Beautiful Lisbon. Then you're on to 2 ports in Spain. And what were you looking forward to? And I'm not sure if I'm going to let you say it because I'm not sure how to say it. Is it Cadiz?
Yeah, Cadiz. So after Lisbon, it was consecutive days at Cadiz, Malaga, Ibiza, and finally in Barcelona.
Okay.
So with Cadiz, we actually decided against staying in Cadiz. Instead, we took an excursion where we went to Sevilla, which is or Seville, but Sevilla is how everybody says it, which is about 2 hours inland from Cadiz. And, you want to talk about stunning in every sense of the word, go to Sevilla. Really well manicured streets with beautiful palaces and gardens and places just to sit and relax and enjoy the ambiance. Sevilla afforded all of that and more. And we had a fantastic tour guide. I think he called himself Uncle George. He was a bit of a character, and he had a really nice vibe to him, really just embracing, like getting all of us to embrace what Sevilla had to offer. We had tapas in one of the restaurants in the city, which was nice. But yeah, see, this is what was kind of interesting for us, never having been to Europe and not really even being familiar with these excursions. When you're on the DCL website, you try to look at the descriptions and figure out if it aligns with your interests or your budget or all these different factors. But it's sometimes hard to know if you're just taking a risk and not sure if it'll work out. With practically all of our European excursions, we felt they were worth the cost. We got a lot out of them. We saw a lot of the highlights. So we fell in love with Sevilla. That's one place that I would definitely want to go back to, along with everywhere else, but particularly Sevilla.
Did you make it into the cathedral there at all by any chance, or did you guys see that at all?
I think we did.
Okay.
This is one of the sad things that I must admit, that after a while, some of the places blend in with one another, just because we went into a lot of cathedrals over the course of 1 week. We went into the Royal Palace, which is called, I think, Real Alcazar, and that had a garden. But we may have popped into the cathedral. Yes, we did. Yes, now I remember we did.
Okay.
So it was very impressive in terms of feel and size, because it had the tomb, Christopher Columbus's tomb, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, that was cool.
Well, cool. Let's move on to Malaga then and Ibiza.
Yeah, Malaga was cool. It's the place where Picasso was from, and there were references to him throughout. And we're talking a lot about Antonio Banderas because he recently portrayed him, and he lives in the city. Ironically enough, I think there was a CBS Sunday morning segment on Antonio Banderas in Malaga shortly before our cruise, so we kind of got a feel of that there. It's a really lovely city as well. I think we went up to the I think it's called the Gibralfaro Castle. So these almost like these castle walls that overlook the city, with really offering some gorgeous views. There's a walking tour component. At times, if you're seeing parts of Europe or parts of Spain in a very concentrated format, I would argue that each city that we visited afforded different perspectives of what life is like, but there were also some common elements in terms of just the relaxed nature of the people, and having those siestas and meals at perhaps different times than some Americans. And it felt very relaxed, and people were very friendly consistently. So we had a very nice impression of Malaga. Ibiza, meanwhile, we enjoyed as well. Ibiza, for those who are unfamiliar, is an island off the southern coast of Spain that at times felt like it could have been almost like one of the Caribbean islands, in terms of it felt a little bit more touristy. It didn't have as much of a unique flavor as I would have liked. The excursion that we went on, we were a little bit disappointed with, because it actually wasn't as long as it should have been, and there was just more time for self-exploration as opposed to actual guided elements. But that was just the nature of what we ended up taking. But it still had a very nice vibe to it. So yeah, that was the conclusion of the main part of the trip.
Yeah, I think they do. I think Disney does a really good job with, if you book excursions through them, finding good tour operators in each one of these cities to give you a really good quality experience. That's been kind of our experience with them, at least. So, the other thing I was kind of thinking of is, you're talking about, thinking about what you would want to do based on price, or what kind of, is interesting to you. The one thing that's sort of tough, and I saw that on our just recent cruise, is like, you can go down to the port excursion desk. So if you're not sure, you could book something, and you could always maybe go and talk to them and say, hey, what is this tour really about? And maybe swap it for something else if it doesn't seem to fit what you think. But the one thing that I found, like on ours, was some of the more popular ones, boy, if you didn't book them ahead of time, you weren't going to be able to to change them out just because our cruise was completely full. I'm not sure if you could have done that on yours with a little bit less people on board. Have you ever tried that at all, going to the port excursion desks and talking to them about some of the different options? We haven't, so...
Yeah, so typically we've only booked them in advance. However, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Steve, because one issue we had encountered was that we knew from previous voyages and even from something we had seen on the website that there was an opportunity to book an excursion once we were in Barcelona, which was our final port. However, at the time, you couldn't book it prior to being on the ship. But once we got on the ship and we inquired, they said, oh, we're not offering an option to Montserrat, which is a place outside Barcelona. So we were kind of curious as to why that was, and we still vocalized interest because we wanted to have the opportunity to go there. And it turns out that after returning back to the Port Adventures desk and then them communicating with us, we were eventually able to get tickets for that excursion. So per what you're saying, you're absolutely right. It is worth talking with them to try to get that clarification, whether it be about a particular excursion or to try to reconcile miscommunication, which seems to have been the case in terms of how they were offering tickets for that particular excursion. Mm-hmm. So never hurts to ask, and usually they'll try to accommodate you in one way or another.
Well, cool. I'm glad you guys were able to experience that once you got to Barcelona then.
Yeah.
So, well, unfortunately, as all things do, and it's probably hard to, when you first step on the ship, 13 days prior, it comes to an end. How was Barcelona and getting off the ship and then moving on to what you guys had planned once you got to Barcelona?
Yeah, well, we were obviously very sad about leaving the ship. It was like a countdown of the last few days of how many more hours do we have?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and after being on there for so long, it really feels like just an endless vacation. But you're right, all things must come to an end. We had about 2 days in Barcelona, and we maximized it as much as possible. We walked around a lot of the downtown area. We were in like Catalunya Plaza area, so that's kind of the big hub of the city, and we walked through a lot of the just old quarters of the city. We went to a bunch of museums, an archaeology history museum that kind of showed the development of the city's origins from hundreds of years ago, in addition to some of the typical sites, why am I blanking? All the Gaudi pieces of architecture.
Right.
Yeah, the La Sagrada Familia, the famous piece that's been under development for a century, is absolutely stunning. We really maximized our time there. And as you might imagine, we ran into other cruise passengers over the course of 48 hours, which is fun because, it's like, it's an extension of the Disney cruise to see people ashore. We actually saw Jeffrey Epstein a couple of times in Barcelona, but it was really nice. We really got a nice feel for the city. Felt like 48 hours probably wasn't enough time, but we were already on a very long vacation as is, so it certainly covered the job. And and then we had some flight issues coming back to the States. Our flight was canceled.
Oh no!
Right at the airport, right when we were about to board, there were a number of issues and complications with the airline, and we had to stay in the city for another day, but yet we didn't actually even have time to explore. So it was kind of a frustrating end to the vacation, but we are huge proponents now of the transatlantic voyage because of what it can offer to folks. And I think it's worth mentioning to the listeners too that, and I think there are still spots for the 2019 eastbound transatlantic voyage, it covers almost entirely the same ports as this one. So I would imagine it's probably a very similar type of voyage. There was only one change in the port, and it may have been one of the latter ones. So even though they vary the transatlantic voyages every now and again, it seems like next year is going to be a pretty similar experience for those who are interested.
Yeah, I was just looking at it. It's Cartagena, Spain, rather than Ibiza.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so there you go. And I liked what they're doing. When we sailed to Norway 2 years ago, ours was the first cruise once it got to Europe. And so it had just done the transatlantic and it had come across the northern part. And it seems like the last couple of years and on into next year, as you're talking about, Brett, they're staying south and being able to experience like the Azores and some of the other different places like that. So I really like that aspect of, it looks like they're coming south on the way over and then looking at coming back. If you decide to do the fall one, they stay a little bit north so you can do Newfoundland maybe as the leaves are changing and that. So I really like what they're doing there with those cruises.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I will say, because I had failed to mention this earlier, this was just the luck of the draw, Steve, but it was actually the smoothest sailing Disney Cruise Line has ever had across the Atlantic, according to them. And according to us, in terms of all of our cruise experiences, it was remarkably smooth. And that may have been just perhaps taking more of a southern route, but we really appreciated that. And that was just, you can't plan that in advance. But
yeah, well, perfect. That was one of the last questions I was going to ask you. Well, as we finish up here, I really love the idea of this cruise. I love the idea of having all those days on board the ship, as you've talked about, and being able to relax and see a lot of different things, like the tour into the galley there at Lumiere's. I would love to be able to see some of that stuff, and I'm sure that our listeners would really love to jump on and experience some of the things you did. So I really like the idea of the 6 days at sea, and then being able to see some very different places in Europe that a lot of us probably won't get to go to unless we do a cruise like this.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's a great way of seeing the world. It's also a nice type of voyage for, you get more immersed on the ship. You get to experience more things. It's also, for those of you who might be adult listeners, there are very few children on board. I think there were about 400 passengers who were children. So it was predominantly adults, but it was obviously when the kids are around, it's still wonderful and fun. There were also a number of DVC members. So about 1/3 of passengers, according to DCL, were DVC. And a bunch of people, Steve, ended up taking the Mediterranean cruise right after the transatlantic. So I think they said 181 passengers were staying on for another week beyond the 13 nights. So it's a great way of, for those who are in that position, it's a great way of continuing the experience. But I think the transatlantic has a lot to offer, particularly those who want to change in their experiences from the Caribbean or their typical type of voyage. And quite honestly, it's a lot more reasonable than one would imagine, because you have those number of sea days. So
yeah, I'm looking at the prices, and it's a lot cheaper than doing a 7-day Caribbean at certain parts of the years, and there you are for 13 days. So, yeah. Well, awesome, Brett. What's next for you guys? Did you rebook while you were on board, or where are you guys thinking about heading next?
Yeah, I think we might take a little bit of a break. Usually we've been going on one Disney cruise a year. I think we're going to take a little bit of a break for now, even though we had a fantastic experience. But we definitely would be interested in taking another transatlantic, because that at least for us, that'll be probably the best way of seeing Europe. Yeah, I continue to love Disney Cruise Line. This reinforced my passion for it. I actually was documenting the trip the whole way. So if folks look for me on YouTube, they search my name, which is Brett, Brett, and then my last name is Nachman, Nachman. I actually have a couple of really long videos that document all the different aspects of the voyage, so you can kind of get a little bit of perspective of what that type of trip is like. So I appreciate all that you're doing and contributing to the community and affording listeners the chance to get to know more about different types of voyages, different aspects of DCL, because, we're once you're a Disney cruiser, you're always a Disney cruiser. So
yeah, definitely. Well, hey, make sure you send that to me, message that to me, and I'll make sure that I get those links set in the show notes as well for everybody, so they can click right onto it. So cool. That'd be extra special for people that want to follow along a little bit more on what we talked about today. Well, thank you, Brett, so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed the time listening to your and your family's trip across the transatlantic. And I want to thank you so much for listening, and once again, just taking time out of your day to share your experiences with the listeners. So I appreciate it. And when you guys go on your next cruise, or hopefully sometime maybe go to Disneyland or something like that, let me know, and we'll have you back on and we'll talk some more Disney, huh?
Sounds great, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
All right, great. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Well, that's going to wrap up our show today. Once again, I'd like to thank Brett for coming on and taking time out of his busy schedule to share his family's experience as they sailed on the eastbound transatlantic over to Europe on the Disney Magic. What just an amazing voyage, and so many different opportunities to do so many different things on a longer voyage with so many sea days and just some really cool different destinations in Europe as well. Well, if you've been enjoying what you're hearing, we sure would appreciate it if you would pass it on to others who you might think would enjoy our podcast. It helps us get the word out about our show and the cruising in the Disney community. And as we move on into summer, we've got a lot of shows coming up, some different ones here in the next couple weeks. If you would like to come on and share your experiences with us, you can always get a hold of Christy and I through either Facebook or Twitter. You can reach me at Facebook at DCL Podcast, or on Twitter at DCL Podcast as well. And you can always reach Christy at Pack Your Pixie Dust on Facebook and Pack YR Pixie Dust on Twitter as well. So between now and our next show, if you guys are heading out on your next vacation, all of us here at the DCL Podcast would like to wish you fair winds and safe travels as you head out on your next adventure. Once again, thanks for coming back and taking a listen, and we'll see you next time on the DCL Podcast.